Today we're going to look at how pairs of angles may be related to each other. So we're going to look at a few terms and make sure we understand the meaning of those terms. So the first term that we're going to look at is adjacent angles. Okay, so what does it mean to be adjacent to something, anything? Well, if I'm adjacent to something, I'm next to it. It's the same exact thing for angles. Adjacent angles are next to each other. So not just that they're next to each other. So for example, just because that angle and that angle are next to each other, they are not adjacent angles. I know they're side by side, but that's not enough. To be adjacent, you also have to, let's see, so let's just X this out so we're not confused. To be adjacent, the angles have to share a common side. So for example, if I have one angle here, and then I have another angle here. So we have a side which is common. So let's call it the common side. Once there's a common side and the angles are next to each other, then they're adjacent angles. The next angle relationship we're going to look at is called linear pairs. So that's linear pairs. And it's exactly what it sounds like, a pair of angles that makes a line. So if I have an angle here, oh boy, that's a good angle, and then an angle over here, notice you have, or two rays, one ray over here, and one ray over, let's get a different color up here, and one ray over here, and together with our rays powers combined, we get, lo and behold, a straight line that's extended infinitely in both directions. So when our two angles create that situation, so let's say angle 1 and angle 2, they are a linear pair. So a linear pair is a pair of adjacent angles, so it has to be adjacent, that's a must, that have opposite rays. And by opposite rays, I just mean that the rays are pointing in opposite direction. One ray to the right, one ray to the left in this case. Alright, so that's a linear pair. Okay, so the third relationship that I'm looking at today is vertical angles. And this is probably one of my favorite ones because it shows up so very often. Alright, so vertical angles, I nickname it the X angles. So the reason why I would name it the X angles is because it's actually formed by something that looks like an X. So we have two lines that are intersecting, so one line here and one line there, and they're going to have, alright, so we have an angle here which is opposite or vertical to an angle here. So vertical angles are two non-adjacent, so they can't be next to each other, formed by intersecting lines. So as long as you have two intersecting lines, let's actually get our intersecting lines to look a little different. So as long as you have two intersecting lines, so let's go here and here. Oh, that looks exactly the same. Alright, so as long as you have two intersecting lines and you want to pick out vertical angles, then if that is one of your angles, the other angle cannot be next to it. So the only other angle not next to it is over here, and that's what makes it vertical. So I call it the X angle. As you can see here, it kind of looks like an X, and the top and bottom of your X would be vertical, so would the left and the right of your X. Alright, next one. So the word congruent comes up all the time. We can have congruent shapes, we can have congruent line segments, we can also have congruent angles, and that's what I'm going to mention right now. So what is a congruent angle? Well, it's exactly what you probably think it is. So congruent angles are equal in measure. So if I have an angle here that is 35 degrees, and I have an angle here that is also 35 degrees, those angles are congruent to each other because the measurement of the angles are the same. It doesn't matter that the orientation is different. So bringing it back to the vertical angle situation again, now I can mention to you that if we have two vertical angles, they are also congruent. The measurement will be the same. So you should probably take note of that. Vertical angles are congruent. So the measurement is the same. All right, so now that we know what congruent angles are, we are almost done with this video. A couple more to go. Okay, so now we're going to look at complementary angles. And when I hear the word complementary, I think of, two people who are very different from each other, but when they come together, they create a whole thing that is beautiful. Now, if you want to think of it that way, just think of a 90-degree angle as something that's beautiful, because when you bring two angles together that are complementary, they add up to 90 degrees. So for example, if I have one angle here, and that angle is 40 degrees, then what is complementary to it? Something that completes it to create 90 degrees. So we have 50 degrees. So these two angles are complementary to each other because they add up to 90 degrees. How about if I had two angles, and maybe let's say this is 25 degrees, and all the way over here in a funny slanty way we have another angle, and that is, let's say, 65 degrees. All right, well, even though these angles are not next to each other, they're not adjacent, and they are not in the same orientation, they do add up to 90 degrees, and they are also complementary angles. So as long as they add up to 90 degrees, the angles are complementary. All right, so now we're going to look at supplementary angles. And supplementary angles kind of work like how complementary angles work, but with a slight twist. So supplementary angles add up not to 90, but to 180. So supplementary angles have a sum of 180. So let's say that that is 30 degrees over here. So that angle and this angle, which is 150, are supplementary to each other because they add up to 180 degrees. Just like complementary angles, however, they don't need to be next to each other. They can be completely separate from each other. So we can have an angle here of 60 and an angle over here. Well, let's fix that up a little bit. And an angle over here of 120. And because those two angles do add up to 180, they are still supplementary.